Hello, my name is Melanie Godfrey, and this is my presentation on racism and its impact on families. So, what is racism? Racism has many definitions. The Merriam-Webster dictionary actually has three definitions for racism. So, the first one is the belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. The second definition is that this is the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. The third definition is a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. So, what is the impact? Um, Race-based traumatic stress is the cumulative effect of racism on an individual or group's mental and physical health, which have been documented to have significant impact on the overall well-being of communities of color. So the results of these impacts and the results of the race-based traumatic stress includes higher levels of intergenerational family stress, increased likelihood of illicit substance use, alcohol use disorder, higher rates of domestic violence, higher rates of physical illness, including obesity, heart disease, and diabetes, parental incarceration, displacements, abuse and neglect, and internalized racism. Those most likely to be impacted by racism in the U.S. are Blacks, Hispanics, Indigenous people, and other people of color, including immigrants from all over. Uh, and other risk factors beyond skin color include low income. Well, these are the results of the impact include low income, low levels of education, poor quality of education, employment status, and area code. So also I want to go over what race is because race doesn't have a definitive definition on what makes someone a certain race. Um, Culture does, but race does not. In the US, race is determined often by physical characteristics such as skin color, which would be number one, hair texture, nose width, and lip thickness. Those have been the racial identity markers that we use in the United States for a long time. So, my literature review starts after the Emancipation Proclamation, so post slavery, and after the Civil War. So, in 1865 to 1866, a set of laws were enacted called Black Codes. The first of Black Codes were enacted in Missouri and South Carolina, and then throughout the South. So, the purpose of Black Codes were to limit the freedoms of Black families and to maintain them as a cheap labor force, and then pretty much put them back into slavery through harsh penalties for offenses, trivial and minor offenses. And then my slide says 1965, but it's supposed to say 1865. So also in 1865, Jim Crow laws were enacted, and they legalized segregation based on race, and they reduced the living quality for Black people. Um, Also in 1865 was the formation of the KKK, and the KKK was formed by a group of white men who idealized white racial superiority. They tortured and murdered Black people and white people who supported the Reconstruction, because at the time Reconstruction was enfranchising newly um, freed people who were enslaved. So they pretty much became their own policing unit, and they harassed and tortured and murdered people. So then, based on race. And the reason why I put 1865 to 1882 was because in 1882 they dissipated, but there was a resurgence in 1915 after the movie Birth of a Nation was released. Um, also, I want to go back to the Black codes. So, just to give an example of how Black codes significantly impacted Black families, uh, in South Carolina, they passed a Black code that prohibited Black people from holding any other occupation other than a farmer or a servant. And this is how these policies kept Black people from making any sizable income or growing any substantial wealth in the late 1800s. And these were the first systemic form of systemic racism or laws and policies um, that were put on a group of people post slavery. Going back to 1888, which was the expansion of Jim Crow laws, and these pretty much went from the north, from the south, and then went up to the north and covered more systems and in America. And I added this sign. This sign that says "No dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans," and this sign was made by a person based in Dallas, and it was distributed around the country. It hung in many restaurant windows. Um, this is what I guess any person would have saw back in the 1960s, hanging in the typical restaurant window. So moving over to the 1900s, you have, I'm sorry, in the 1900s, you have in 1907 eugenics. So eugenics started as a scientific movement that was based on the theory that selective breeding of people could achieve a racial or human improvement. Um, they highly excluded people of color, people with disabilities, and people who identified as LGBTQ. Throughout the 20th century, though, this theory was discredited as unscientific and racially biased for the way it targeted Jewish people, disabled people, and minority groups. Also, eugenics was used by its theorists and supporters to justify xenophobia, anti Semitism, sexism, colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. So, moving on into redlining. Redlining was a systemic approach to denying people of color access to real estate. And I want to just take a moment to dig in more into redlining to explain more of what it was. So in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration, also known as the FHA, began refusing to insure mortgages in and around neighborhoods with predominantly more Black people, also known as redlining. At the time, the FHA was subsidizing the mass production of subdivisions for whites with the requirement that the houses that they built not be sold to blacks. So the FHA's justification was that if a black person bought the homes in these suburbs, that the housing property the property values would go down, and thus putting the mortgages that they were insuring at risk. However, this was not based on any type of study, and in fact, they found that it was found that when black people tried to buy homes in all white neighborhoods or in mostly white neighborhoods, property values actually rose because blacks were willing to pay more for those properties than whites were. And this was simply because the housing supply in black neighborhoods were so restricted and they had so little options. And the impact is still felt today because the middle class in the United States mostly builds its wealth through home ownership, through equity. And then they pass it on through next generation. So many of the homes blacks were banned from buying were actually equally affordable by both blacks and whites. However, only whites were able to purchase them, and it is estimated that those houses now sell for no less than $300,000 to $400,000, like minimum. Studies have linked redlining to the wealth gap between blacks and whites today. And if you would like to look more into systemic racism and its impact on housing, This book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, uh, was amazing. The article that I read, Roberts and Rizzo 2021, they got a lot of their information from this book, so I ordered a copy. Um, I, I mean, I, I would say check this out, I guess, at a library, see if you like it. Very informative. Moving along to the war on drugs. Um, So looking at two major laws in the war on drugs. So the first one was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This established mandatory minimum sentencing. It also increased the penalties for crack cocaine use versus powder cocaine. And why this is significant and important is because crack cocaine at the time was used mostly by blacks and powder cocaine was used mostly by whites. However, it was only crack cocaine that had the harsher penalty. So this played a large role in who was arrested, who was then incarcerated, and who and how long they stayed in prison. Um, then we look at the 1994 crime bill, um, also known as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which was signed into law by President Bill Clinton. And this featured the largest expansion of the federal death penalty. It also introduced trying 13-year-olds as adults, and it put 100,000 new cops on the streets. Many scholars attribute the 1994 crime bill to normalizing modern day racial profiling. And today we know that these policies impacted families of color more significantly, and you can look at the incarceration rates, all of them, and see where the disparities are. For example, Black Americans represent 13% of drug users. However, they make up over one third, so over 33% of individuals who are arrested for drug offenses, and over half, so over 50% of those who are convicted for drug offenses. Um, so there's significant impact there. Moving along to the 2000s,